We'll return to the broader content of this quote a few times later on, but for now, I'd like to use just a tiny snippet of it to open the door for this discussion.
Further, the power of the sword, even so far as it is placed in the hands of Congress, is subject to the control of the state legislatures, for they name one branch of the federal government, the Senate. Tench Coxe, to the citizens of the United States, Pennsylvania Gazette.
Notice his mention of the state legislatures controlling the Senate. This may not make sense, since today, senators are directly elected by the people. But stop and think about that for a minute. Congress is broken up into two houses: the House of Representatives, which is directly elected by the people, and the Senate, which is also directly elected by the people. What's the point? Why have two houses which are basically the same? Why not just have one House of Congress? It's simple. That's not how it was originally designed. When the Constitution was written, senators were not directly elected by the people, but instead, they were appointed by the state governments. The reason that Congress was split into two houses was to provide representation for both styles of power. It also allowed a compromise between opposing views on the distribution of power among the states. Should all states have equal power in Congress? Or should a state's power be proportional to its population, so that bigger states have more power than smaller states? The compromise was to break Congress up into two houses. Power in the House of Representatives is proportional to population, while power in the Senate is equal for all states, and both houses must cooperate in order to wield the power of Congress. This approach allows bigger states to have more power in accordance with their higher populations, but also tempers it to prevent small states from being ignored or bullied. The purpose of the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives served as the citizens' voice in the federal government. They are directly elected by the people, but they are elected from districts which are small, one representative for every 30,000 people. But that is 30,000 people total, not voters. When you consider it in terms of number of households, it's even smaller.
The House of Representatives shall be composed of members chosen every second year by the people of the several states. The number of representatives shall not exceed one for every 30,000, but each state shall have at least one representative. Article 1, Section 2 of the United States Constitution.
The goal was that their district was small enough that they don't need lots of money to get elected, and that the people in that district feel like their voice matters, and that their representative will actually listen to them. Originally, the number of representatives was supposed to increase as the population increased. That was one of the main reasons for the routine census, to determine the number of people, and thus determine the number of representatives that are required for a given region, and how they need to redraw the districts. However, in 1929, the Permanent Apportionment Act capped the number of representatives to 435. Now, as the U.S. population grows, they simply redistribute the seats, but they do not make more seats. The consequence of this is that each district gets bigger and bigger in terms of population, further diluting the voice of individual people in their district, as well as increasing the need and incentive for campaign financing, and thus opening the door for private interests' influence in elections. The purpose of the Senate. On the other hand, the Senate served as the voice of the state governments in the federal government. They were appointed by the state legislature.
The Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state, chosen by the legislature thereof for 6 years, and each senator shall have 1 vote. Article 1, Section 3 of the United States Constitution.
To clarify, while each senator's term is 6 years, the starting point of those terms are staggered, such that 1/3 of the Senate is reappointed every 2 years. This prevents the entire Senate from being replaced in one go, and allows the majority of the Senate to remain unchanged at every cycle, so there's not too much confusion or disruption at any one time. This ensures that there is some degree of retained knowledge, i.e., people who already know what's going on, to carry over into the next term, and allows things to keep running smoothly while the new senators settle in and get up to speed.
They shall be divided as equally as may be into 3 classes. The seats of the senators of the first class shall be vacated at the expiration of the 2nd year, of the 2nd class at the expiration of the 4th year, and of the 3rd class at the expiration of the 6th year, so that 1/3 may be chosen every 2nd year. Article 1, Section 3 of the United States Constitution.
Essentially, senators were intended to be diplomats from the states to the federal government, to convey the will of their state to Congress. Because back in the day, when you wanted to send a message to someone or have a real-time conversation with them, you literally had to put a guy on a horse and physically travel to them. So you need someone who can be physically there at the federal government, who can speak and negotiate on behalf of the state, who is weeks away. This is also part of the reason why each state has 2 senators instead of just 1. It means that one of the senators could travel back to the state to confer with the legislature or governor, while the other senator stayed in Washington. In fact, if the internet had existed at the time the Constitution was written, it's possible that senators wouldn't even exist, and instead, the Senate would consist of an electronic system which collated and consolidated the decisions of the state legislatures. However, once again, this is no longer the case. Some people had proposed making senators elected by the people as far back as 1826, but such proposals never got traction. However, in the late 1800s, the rise of the Populist Party promoted the idea as a means of increasing government accountability to the people. In 1912, Congress passed the 17th Amendment, ratified in 1913, which changed it so that rather than being appointed by the state legislatures, senators would now be directly elected by the people. This effectively severed the authority of state governments over their senators.
The Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state, elected by the people thereof for 6 years, and each senator shall have 1 vote. 17th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution.
Which now means that senators have to campaign for an entire state. But the average state in the U.S. has almost 6 million people. There is no way to campaign for an election on that scale without a large amount of money, which again creates the need and incentive for external sources of campaign financing, which opens the door for private interests influencing elections. Also, once elected, the senators are subject to no one. They are guaranteed their seat for 6 years, and they have the power of an entire state in the federal government. Or I guess half a state, since there are 2 senators per state. They're basically a duke. But before we go too far blaming Congress alone, it should be noted that the states ratified that amendment and accepted it into the Constitution. So it's also the states' fault. The Populist Party gained traction within the states and ultimately motivated them to not only accept this amendment, but propose it in the first place. Even though this amendment was not passed until 1912, as far back as the 1890s, the House of Representatives made multiple attempts to achieve a similar amendment, but the Senate repeatedly refused to even vote on it. It wasn't until many states started initiating the process of calling a constitutional convention, the method by which state governments can modify the Constitution on their own, bypassing Congress, that the Senate finally agreed to pass the amendment in order to prevent the Constitutional Convention. However, this begs the question: if at this point in history the senators were still appointed by the state governments, and the purpose of the Senate is to convey the will of the states in Congress, then why would the Senate refuse to pass something that the states were asking for? Because the states were already losing control over the Senate, and this amendment, which was intended to rein them in, only made things worse. The President, a national election for one man. Given my criticisms of the changes to both the House and Senate, resulting in large-scale elections which require large amounts of money and thus open the door for external funding influences upon the government, you might ask, what about the president? That's one guy campaigning for the entire country. And you're right, that's true. However, let's remember the old checks and balances. Congress has the power to impeach the president if he did get out of control. So even though the president does have some degree of sole autonomous power, he wields that power under the constant monitoring and threat of expulsion by the Congress. Also, something else to keep in mind is that the president was never intended to have the degree of power that modern presidents do today. In fact, the entire federal government was never intended to have the degree of power that it does today. So, if the entire federal government as a whole didn't have nearly the extreme and invasive power that it does today, then the fact that one guy had a large portion of that limited power to himself isn't that much of a threat. 99% of 1 gallon is nothing compared to 1% of the ocean, especially if each state's government still stood as a diligent intercessor between its citizens and that federal government, and if the states also maintained their 50% control over the federal Congress to monitor and correct it. Now, you may counter by saying that the president does have command over,
quote, the Army and Navy of the United States and of the militia of the several states when called into the actual service of the United States. Article 2, Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution.
and thus he could attempt to leverage this power to nefarious ends. But again, Congress could simply impeach him and remove him from command. Second, and we'll have a whole section on this later, but the Constitution also imposes a 2-year limit on military funding. So even if Congress chose not to impeach the corrupt president and expel him from his position, Congress still has the leverage of the funding limit. So even if Congress did nothing, in less than 2 years, the military would go bankrupt, and the tyrannical president would be left attempting to command the military with nothing but promises and IOUs. As always, for this article's sources, more articles, or to get a copy of the book, visit weepingdragon.com.